try and get the lights. If we could turn one light off, or two of those there. I want this one on, because I'm going to need that to read. Which is that one.
Yes, that one.
That's clear enough. The picture's not bad. That's good. Right, well, yes, they said to me when we were doing the programme last year, January and February is a waste of time, really, to get a couple of dozen there, perhaps. So I said, all right, I'll get that to talk about stock lodge just and use hour for hour. And there must be 50, 60 here, so it's taken me a bit by surprise as well. Anyway, first thing I want to do is take a little walk down Back Lane, and we'll start here, Foster's Close. I took this photograph, just meaning to get the notice in. I didn't realise what a lovely country scene I'd picked. I've got the church in the background and the horses in the field. So I did a nice country scene when I was really after the Foster's Close. Moving on, Back Lane. Coach House, many of you will recognise that front door. Laundry Cottage.
This is from.
Stock Lodge Cottage, rather gives it going away. And now we'll take a short diversion across the road. Just a clump of trees. Bare at this time of year, but I picked a sunny day with no snow. I've gone down Dakin Drive to the first bend where the rusty railings are. That sloping field there. Right. So what's the connection? There's the office, Stock Lodge, all of those stuff. Coming back to the first one, Foster's Close, named after the last family to live there before the conversion to apartments. Members of the Foster's family still own the field, which is enclosed by School Lane on one side and the S-Bends at the other end, right round to the main road. Clearly the next three cottages I showed you took their names from Stock Lodge, or the associated trades that were going on there, functions in relation to the house. With regards to Laundry Cottage, which I showed you, there was some argument which end of the building was the laundry and which end perhaps was the bakery. Recently some pipes were found in the end which is now number 25, whereas 23 may have been the bakery, so there's some argument there, but one of those was certainly the laundry. Anyway, they're both in the same complex. The trees, well, anyone who lives in Back Lane will know those trees, especially when they drop their leaves in the autumn. I understand they were planted under the direction of the owners of Stock Lodge to hide the airy houses, which used to stand where Vernon Close is now. Or it may be the other way around, to stop the airy houses people looking at Stock Lodge. The trees were actually planted by Horace Luckin's father, the late Horace Luckin, who lived on the corner of Dakin Drive and died quite recently. He told me his father planted those trees sometime just around the end of the war. And the meadow, well, most of you will recognise it after driving around Dakin Drive by those rusty railings. And that field running down from there, and indeed all the houses in Dakin Drive to that point, all came under the former Stock Lodge estate. Indeed, the field may still be under the ownership of the Foster family, for all I know. Not only that, but the modern houses in Back Lane, past the cottages, including High Trees, where I and Richard here live, were all in the grounds of Stock Lodge as well. So it was a quite extensive estate in its time. The older members of the village will have no difficulty to go back 2, perhaps even 3 generations of owners before the conversion into apartments, or more correctly, houses. Each is a 2-storey house rather than an apartment, and each has its own freehold. and that conversion was done between 1965 and 1966. So, by conveyance dated 1st of June 1965, the freehold property known as Stock Lodge was sold to T. Waller Estate Developments Limited, and it was that company that organised the conversion of the main house and either developed or sold a parcel of land from the former gardens for the subsequent development by others, resulting in all that the houses have been having over there.
Famous tonight.
This is a photograph of Stock Lodge around 2000. Note one thing about it at this stage, there are no chimney pots. The sale didn't include at that stage the cottages along Back Lane or the paddock fronting onto School Lane. These remained within the ownership of the Foster family. The Fosters were in occupation from 1946 until 1965. Joseph Thomasin Foster of Pontlands, Great Baddow, acquired the property on the 31st of May 1946. I've got two photographs around that time. And no chimney pots at that stage. The ground floor room here with the blank end is the original billiard room. And the two adjacent windows, which you can just see, these two, were the hall, and the window just out of the picture here was the start of the drawing room. Right, if anybody can date their cars, they can date this photograph for me. I don't know if it's an old Wolseley. Yeah, I think it is, don't you? Yeah. This view turns the corner of the house and shows two further windows in the drawing room. Next would have been, there's one window there, one window, your picture's not quite as big as mine, it's a little bit missing, but one more window there, which was the drawing room. And then if you move out of the picture, it came the bay window, which was the dining room. Now, it may be that those two rooms have changed their roles in the latter years, because Pat is quite convinced that the bay window room, in the section where she lived, was the drawing room at the time when the conversion took place. So it looks like they changed their role. Now these pictures come courtesy of Brian Clifford of Royal Lane. Brian also remembers his father collecting coal by horse and cart from Ricky Station and delivering it to the Fosters, first at Gingjoy, which is in Mill Road, where I assume they lived previously, and later to Stock Lodge. He did some gardening, looked after two cows which lived in that meadow you saw in the photograph. And his mother cleaned the Stock Lodge, so they were quite heavily involved with the family. Note in this photograph, where the car is standing, there is no conservatory. Later on I'll show you that there was a conservatory standing at that point. Although there appears to be no access to the house, the windows look original, so I think it was just an external conservatory. And that little strip of different coloured concrete at the bottom there, I think is significant actually. Joseph Thomasin Foster lived at Stock Lodge with his wife, son Mark Thomasin Foster and daughter Jane. Mark, who recently retired from Great Leys in the West Country, owns the paddock, previously mentioned, and Jane, who subsequently married and became a Mrs. Wilkinson, also moved to the West Country, from where she still acts as landlord for the one cottage that remains in their ownership. Joseph Foster was chairman of the Stock Parish Council from 1946 to 1949. He was born around September 1898 in Hutton, Essex, and died on the 4th of April 1958 in St Bartholomew's Hospital in London. And it was his widow, Margaret Nancy, or was known as Nancy, and his brother Hugh Marshall Foster, a fruit farmer of Hatfield Peveril, They were jointly granted probate of his will and completed the sale of the property, acting as his personal representatives. The Fosters, together with a Miss Shirley Cook, bred Connemara ponies in the field behind the house. Miss Cook, who also lived at Stock Lodge, was chief instructor for the British Horse Society examinations, and then helped as a volunteer with a disabled group at Brook Farm Riding School until 2007, when she sadly suffered a stroke and had to give up that work. After the war, the grounds were opened each June for the village fete. Many villages may remember that. Bowling the pig was a very popular attraction, and keeping this out going took up to 6 gardeners at that time. I can go back another generation. The previous owners were the Brazier Craigs, and some villages will remember those, I'm sure. It was bought in the name of Agnes Fanny Marland Brazier Craig, wife of Kilner Charles Brazier Craig of Netherseal Hall, Burton-on-Trent, Staffordshire, Colonel in His Majesty's Army. And this acquisition on the 7th of April 1925 was from Sir James Wilcox, GCMG, GCB, KCSI, DSO, General in His Majesty's Army. The old pals act here, but I'm looking. The consideration in 1925 was $5,250. Oh, that included 2 cottages and the field of some 8.38 acres. Namely, much of what is now Dakin and all the houses that we took from there. The general consensus among the present homeowners along that stretch of back lane where all cottages are is that these 2 cottages here, which were marked off separately on the plan but were sold with it, are numbers 27 and 29, where Angela Bill now lives, secretary, and the one next to her. They're the 2 called Stock Lodge cottages, 1 and 2. And we think they're the 2. The next 2 weren't in the sale. Stock Lodge is somewhere in the middle of that red patch, and the field, as you can see, narrow part is Dakin Drive, and the wider part is the existing field as it is now. I'll deal with General Sir James Wilcox first. He was the chap who sold it to Brazier Craig. He was born in Bharat, India, the 1st of April 1857. He was gazetted to the 100th foot in the Punjab in 1878. He reached adjutant between 1889 and 1890. He commanded the Ashanti Field Force during the relief of Kumasi in July 1900 and was given command of the Northern Army in India in 1910. He had a very good military career. He was in command of the India Army Corps in France from 1914 until 1915. When he resigned, I wonder how many of our lads in France in 1914 would have liked to resign, you know. He was subsequently Governor of Bermuda from 1917 to 1922. And he died in Bharatpur on the 18th of December 1926. I think that must have came in India. So his life was born, his life was more or less dedicated to India, except that it's done in Bermuda. Where he found time to live at Stock Lodge, I'm not quite sure. I found no mention as a result of that of the family or any information related to the time that Sir James Wilcox lived in Stock. On the other hand, several village people have memories of Mr. Brazier Craig during his reign. Both Jim Springett and the ubiquitous Billy Hewitt remember sledging down his sloping meadow behind Dakin Drive and finishing up in the watercress beds at the bottom. Billy tells many yarns about when he lived in Back Lane, because some of the houses there were unoccupied at that time, they were not converted into houses, and he obviously was chased off by Mr. Brazier Craig on a few occasions. Kilner Charles Brazier Craig was born 26th of April 1869 and was formerly from Craig Castle in Ireland. In 1938, their son Kilner Rupert Brazier Craig, the Royal Artillery, married from Stock Lodge, and Miss Elizabeth Mary McGaw, Molly McGaw she was called. He was born 12th of December 1909 in Shifnal, Shropshire, and died 4th of April 2002 in Naples, Florida. He had a distinguished military career. He seems to Stock Lodge, specialised in military people, rising to Major General and was honoured with the KBE, CBE, DSO, as well as being an officer of the United States of America Legion of Merit. I do not know if he had any siblings. I suspect it was son Rupert, who just talked about, rather than his father, who nearly took a pot shot at an unfortunate World War II airman who had bowed out of his crashing plane, was hanging suspended in the trees in Stock Lodge. Fortunately, someone realised he was RAF, not German. I can go back one more change of ownership in some detail. I do have that some notice here because some people will want to look at it in more detail. This is the sale notice, as you see at the top there.
Yeah.
Probably just about readable. It's not really, is it? By order of the executives of Marmaduke Matthews, deceased. And the date was May the 29th, 1918. So it's by order of the executors of Marmaduke Matthews, deceased, who had pleaded died sometime before 29th of May 1918. Note that the sale includes 4 cottages, which is not legible there, 8 acres of meadowland and Church Green Cottage, which you can see. I'm assuming that it was as a result of this auction that Sir James Wilcox became the next owner. I've not managed to find who actually bought the property, but it's that time span when he bought it, and there was no one else in between. This was banging the period when he was in Bermuda, so I'm not quite sure how he managed to buy it. That shows the conservatory, yes, you'll see that clear, I think. That's a plan of the estate, showing the lot. They're not as clear as they are on my screen, of course. The main area is here, where the lodges. Lot 2 and Lot 3 were there. Lot 4 was Church Green Cottage, and Lot 5 is the field here. That plan was clearly taken from the Ordnance Survey map of 1896. And if you get that in your mind, you can see the same triangular shape there from the top cut which is on the score. It's not quite clear how these gardens work out here. There's been a lot of talk about it, that the gardens don't run behind the houses to which they apply. And it shows on these plans here that these 2 houses had those 2 gardens, which pinched a bit of next door's garden. And this area here is 2 cottages, and this was the cowshed. And the cowshed had this garden, and this is where Billy used to play apparently, in the cowshed there. So
You think that was all
there's
one
5 houses and 4 gardens, yes, it's a bit strange. Pardon? Billy Hewitt, we talked about him at many meetings. He won't come. I should have showed you on the last page. It will come up again in the corner. I can go back. In that corner there, it's marked Powerhouse. And that's a little barn that stood in the corner of the paddock there just before they developed Foster Close, which I assumed was just the old barn, stable of some sort. It was actually a powerhouse. If we'd known that some while ago, I think it could have been put as a reserve building because it had some very important purpose with regard to Stoke Lodge. It's a shame it's been demolished, it's gone. Right, the particulars of Lot 1. The residence stood in 8 acres, 3 rods. There's ornamental tennis courts, croquet lawns, kitchen garden, nut plantation, whatever a nut plantation is, fish ponds, greenhouses, etc. Cow house was loft over, presumably back lane, and the paddock we've talked about. When I moved into my house in High Trees, there were remnants of the orchard still standing there, but they went in the 1987 hurricane. One ancient tree does still survive, in fact in Mr. Richard Allen's garden. He once spit on me. Here's the piece of timber from it. This one large fell last winter. It burns very well, Richard. Any guesses? Anybody who's a wood expert can have a look. That's a mulberry.
That's right, there was a big mulberry tree in the garden.
It's still there, it's still alive, although one big branch fell off. It burns very well. I'll flick through these quite quickly because I'm not showing up too well on the screen, but the actual copy of the leaflet is there and will be clearer. That is the plan. In fact, it's a very different. The billy roof is visible there. Trouble is, when I turn round, that's a different view to what I've got there. That is the billy room. The porch now is here, but I'm quite convinced the porch was round here, the billiard room was a new addition. So that was the main entrance into the house there. And these rooms then are marked as we discussed. Dining room and drawing room. So the other way around. That was drawing room, that was dining room. Tom now says that they were all reversed. The first floor is then detailed. The first one had 7 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. So it must have been a bit of a scramble in the mornings. Plus there were 3 servants' bedrooms, all with fireplaces. The ground floor, which should be coming up next, there's kitchen, scullery, larder, store cupboard, servants' hall and butler's pantry. We're all detailed there. The next one is the basement and stabling. The basement was bigger than the average. Now, when I look at it, certainly the wine cellar was. I'll read this bit because yes, the commodious stabling is described in detail, plus the brickwork carbide shed for acetylene gas, which is installed throughout the house, which is 1918, whilst there is a continuous supply of water at high pressure to the house and gardens, pumped up from the peat well, which was 365 feet deep. By an oil engine in brick-built engine house. That was all gone, unfortunately. Note, the buyer of Lot 1, the main house, will have the option of purchasing Lot 2 at the sum of £300, providing he, and it says he, exercises such option immediately upon the fall of the hammer. So John, you missed out there, because you could have snapped up Angela's place for 150 quid. But that's cheaper than your front porch.
Just think why those guys.
Now this is Lot 2 and Lot 3. Right. Lot 2 was 2 freehold cottages, and that is where Angela Bill now lives and the mum next to her. Lot 3 was also 2 cottages with, at that time, a 3-stable stall and coach house with loft adjoining. So John and Joy Miller's, you live in one.
So it was 2 houses then originally.
The
The
coach
coach
house.
house and 23 was one.
There's three properties.
It says 2, 3.
No, it says there 2 freehold cottages plus the 3-stall stables and coach house.
Yeah.
That conversion was done in 1949 into a residence. And up until that time, Billy Hewitt ran right in there.
It still does.
Church Green Cottage came up as an individual lot, and indeed Miss Watson lived there, who was the sister of Mrs. Foster. Now that is Stock Lodge in around 1925, and the conservatory we talked about is quite plainly on the side. Now, Pat, you suggested that that is a doorway up into the house there. I suspect it goes up onto a platform and you walked along there to the conservatory. That's why the concrete appears different there. I think that's probably what it was.
The bay window is just the same.
That is the bay window.
And there's the French doors in from the bedroom onto the balcony.
And they still had chimney pots there. Again, that's from Brian Clifford. Before the name. Now, it's a genealogist's dream. Well, these are just about real good. To be researching an unusual name, such as Marmaduke Matthews. There he is at the top there. He's 63, widow at that time, a solicitor born in Marlin, Middlesex. Living in Stock Lodge, near the lodge, with his 3 daughters, Emily, Gwendolyn and Constance. His brother-in-law, Daniel Burt, see him there, and Daniel Burt's wife were visiting at the time. He was also a solicitor. And then the rest of the household comprised a number of servants. His marriage appears on the free BMD site, which most of you are probably familiar with, in the second quarter, 1873, at Epsom, to Martha and Calrow. So the household should show in the 1891 census. And indeed it does.
Which census was that?
This is 1881, the last one's 1901. So the 1881 census is another free site provided by the Mormons. And there at the top is Marmaduke, underneath him is Martha, and down the other 3 daughters, Constance. I know there's a few more children in between. Marmaduke had obviously married before, and I found in the 3rd quarter, 1862 at Lewisham, he married Eliza Theodora Capper. Tragically, she had died in the 1st quarter of 1869, presumably following childbirth, as she arrived at young Harold, who's along there, was in that same quarter. This was all confirmed in the earlier 1871 census, when I looked up Marmaduke, where he was recorded as a widower for the first time, and was living with his 5 children in Epsom. He had recruited his unmarried sister and a 17-year-old cousin into the household to help with this upbringing. This is rapidly turning into a Catherine Cookson story. By 1891, Marmaduke, still a solicitor, and second wife Martha were living in lodgings in Hastings, with just the 1 daughter, Mary Theodora, aged 23. No explanation of why there was this apparent deterioration in their status. It may be he'd gone there on job, it may be between houses, I'm not really sure. It obviously was a temporary arrangement. all of the siblings from that group seem to have fled the nest, and none of the daughters from the second marriage, who were there in 1901, appear in 1891. They were of school age, they may have been at boarding school. Apparently the family were good to the village during the 20-year period that they lived here. The late Mrs. Florence Stammers, formerly Edwards, who lived in the house next to you, and came from Springfield. She worked with the family for 60 years. No, yes, 60. They lived there 60 years, worked for them for 40 years. First at Stock Lodge, and then after the death of Marmaduke and the sale we just saw, at Carpet House behind the present village shop, and then at Red Roofs in Swan Lane. She served the three daughters after the death of their father. Her name was Mrs. Stammers, Mrs. Florence Stammers. Sadly, tragedy had struck Marmaduke for a third time. He lost two wives, and his youngest daughter, Gwendolyn, around 1896, at age 18, was struck blind and deaf. I don't know the cause. I said this was turned into a cat and fish. She still lived into her 80s, however, and relied on Florence Stammers for the last 40 of these. They communicated by hand sign language. And Billy Hewitt, who was an evacuee during the war, and they're still waiting for somebody to come and pick her up. Lived with Mrs. Stammers and remembers going round to Gwendolyn's, and she would recognise his footprints, and you'd only have to touch her and she'd say, "Is that you, Billy?" And so she had a very great sense of knowing who people were. However, in true Cookson style, there is a romantic twist. I'm not sure of the exact timing. It would make sense if it was sometime between 1918 and 1922, while Sir James Wilcox was Governor of Bermuda. The family who were incumbents at Stock Lodge at that time, and were the children of Wilcox, were very friendly with the family in Phryning, and the Phryning crowd were having that house converted. So, while Mr. Wilcox was away, they did a house swap. So the Phryning family came over with their entourage of servants and everybody and lived in Stock Lodge. Including that was the late Mrs. Phyllis Cable, who was unmarried at that time and in service with the Phryning family. The story goes that in her capacity below stairs, it was her lot to answer the door to the butcher boy from the then butcher's shop on the corner of Back Lane. From this chance meeting, she obviously liked more than his pork sausages. Phyllis married the butcher boy, and Mr. and Mrs. Cable enjoyed a long and happy marriage in the village. And they lived in that house, which has recently been reshipped that off since then. So, a little bit of romance. I'm going back to the 1891 census. Marmaduke didn't live there, he lived in his lodgings. But we do have the owner at that time. There was Stephen W. Silver, a colonial merchant, aged 39, and family. There it is, that line there. Okay. Colonial merchant, Church Street, Stock Lodge. He was Stephen Winkworth Silver, and he married Mary Elizabeth Reeve at Marylebone in the second quarter of 1878. He was from a long line of Stephen Winkworth Silvers, who had founded the firm of F.W. Silver and Company, colonial merchants and military outfitters in the early 1800s. In 1852, they expanded the firm on a greenfield site by the Thames at North Woolwich. Greenfield site. So remote that the locals called it Land's End. They dealt in India rubber and waterproof cloth, and they were rivals to Charles Mackintosh at that time. They expanded rapidly, and by 1858 had developed a patented process for the rubber insulation on telegraph cable. They wrapped the cable with rubber and then steamed it, so the rubber all fused together and formed an insulation around the cable. They further advanced their firm into wire drawing and wire rope making. That's the establishment they started. I can read on my plan here, Silvertown India Rubber Company, and over here, Silvertown Telegraph Cable Company. They became so prominent that the area lost its name of Land's End and became known as Silvertown. Still is to this day. After several mergers and acquisitions, they disappeared into standard telephones and cables. But the merchant side of the business continued into the 1920s in Cornhill, London. So, going back 2 more generations of Stock Lodge, in 1871 and 1881, the census returns show an occupier as Mrs. Mary Cook, once with ye and once without ye. Widow, born around 1816 in Kensington. She was described as no occupation in 1871, and houses and dividends in 1881. Looks like she doesn't live now, she was a nun on that side. On each occasion there was a coachman, cook and a couple of further servants living in, and presumably other staff living in the cottages and on back lane. So a lady of some means, but a name like Mary Cook, I'm not going to be able to find who she is. In 1881, a younger unmarried sister, Emily Slater, was also living there, so she may have been a Miss Slater. Nevertheless, I've not been able to find her. This is the 1874 Ordnance Survey map, which would have been about the time, or was in the middle of the time when Mrs. Mary Cook was living there. And Stock Lodge at that time is looking even more ornate. You can't see it on that plan very well, but this area here is laid out with square gardens with square paths running everywhere. So it was even posher than the next time. Sorry, Ordnance Survey map. In 1872, J. Smith, aged 40, was head gardener at Stock Lodge. From 1861 earlier, the census information proved more difficult to make use of. There's no street names recorded, so the stock was just one item. By a process of elimination, I came up with a couple of potential families for 1861. They recognised occupations, not the usual ag lab as we had in those days, and they employed servants. I easily ruled out the first, which was Arthur Peter, because he lived at Eddystone Hall, and a visit to the Essex Records Office established that he did live there. This left a Richard B. Durham, aged 45. This is Richard Durham here, his wife and dozens of kids. He was aged 45, born in Scotland, master mariner. He had a large family of servants. Note where all the children were born. You want to be on here. Singapore, Sydney, Calcutta, London, Calcutta, Singapore, Calcutta, Sydney. In that order. That appears his wife went on his travels with him. Was he the one at Stock Lodge? I have to ask. So back to the Essex Records. The 1861 Kelly's Directory listed him as one of the principal residents of Stock, no address. But the Director of Essex, 1863, also listed him, and this time there was no address. Durham, RB, Stock Lodge, got him. So he was our Stock Lodge man in 1861. And still wading through old directories, I found the Post Office Directory for 1851. Gentry, Stock, Lennox, John, Esquire, Stock Lodge. I've missed out that Robert Bruce Durham did have one more reference, which was Robert Bruce Durham, ship owner, resident of Stock Lodge in Woolston, appeared as a witness at the Old Bailey in 1861, having had his watch and chain stolen by a pickpocket. He was able to identify the villain in court, and the poor fellow got 4 years penal service. So, but again, it's in Stock Lodge, so that would no court. The White's entry for 1851 again confirmed John Lennox. The search as I would, I could not find John Lennox in the 1851 census. Either he'd moved on and the 1851 directory was out of date, or he was an owner and had tenants there. And there were several farmers in 1851. I looked all sorts, I looked at every census. The chances are it was a farmer lived there. I've no way of telling which farmer and rented it from. But that's the only connection I found. But John Lennox did live there, or owned it at that time. There were 3 farming families with servants who could have lived there. 1841, there was a tithe introduced. I've blown it up, but you won't see much at all on there, I'm afraid. Stock Lodge does show it is that building there, and all of these plots have a number on them. Stock Lodge was plot number 11. And then from the Essex Records Office asked for the tithe roll to be brought up, which, well, that is Battery butting in, by the way. Battery comes right over the top. There's the top pub, so that must be Mill Road. Battery almost encroached round onto it. Right, reference to the tithe roll gave me the following. Plot 11. Landowner, Wright, William John. Occupier, Osborne, John. Cottage and garden. He said cottage and garden, that's all. But it was 2 acres, 30 perch in the area, and 18 shillings was paid to the rector. So I think it must be Stock Lodge to a big 2 acres. It didn't include the paddock, that had a different number. But the house itself would have been within 2 acres. The 1841 census, which was in about the same year as this time map, unfortunately there was no Knight on John, there was no Osborne John. But there was, just here, 3 elderly ladies. One was a Mary Osborne, spelled with no E on the end. Fairly sure she was the right person. It was the only family in stock who weren't agricultural labourers, and had 3 independent ladies living there with female, and male servants. That's what those initials stand for. Yes. So 3 servants and 3 independent ladies living there. So I suggest that Mrs. Osborne is indeed the family that we're talking about. So that ends the chain of 7 census returns that proved so useful to us as archaeologists. I'm not quite done yet, because there was Morwenna who spotted in an early mention of a certain Horace Batcham, who according to White's directory was living in Stock Lodge in 1826-1827. Nothing else about him. Even earlier, I have from the Gentleman's Magazine of 1818, marriages on June 22nd, Thomas Eastwood, Esquire of Stock Lodge, Essex, to Catherine Ann, second daughter of James Taylor of Lee. So we're back to 1818. So how old is Stock Lodge? The only firm date I have for any of the dwellings on the Lodge estate is for the cottages numbered 23 and 25 in Back Lane, where the deeds go back to 1723. Sure, that's good. They were a form of barn dwelling, cattle below and people living above. Back Lane is apparently the oldest road in Stock, the old salt route from Hawley. Folk living in the housing that was formerly in the grounds of Stock Lodge were full of unearthed bits and pieces. The whole area was just one big bonfire. All of these cottages here are from out of Stock Lodge ground. I dug up horses' feet, so my house seems to be in the state. We've all dug up bottles and pots and whatever. John Lennon has uncovered a brick cache in his back garden. No reason why it was there, but
Well, I dug 6 foot deep and I was finding brick walls all around me, but I don't know if it was well underneath or not, I've no idea. I'd have fit in quick.
You only had another 359 feet to go.
I took 1,000 bricks out of there. 2 weeks before I found these bricks, I paid £1,000 bricks. 1,000. All stock bricks.
the houses number 17 and 19 in back, they didn't feature in any of the sales, but they were obviously involved as well, and I was involved in the repair of one of the houses, and before the back wall was rebuilt because it was bulging, it had a very distinct diamond pattern, as they used to do in brickwork, meaning that was the front of the house. It had a big front door in the back of the house, and it backed on the back lane, which I thought was perhaps why it was called back lane, because it was the back of the house. And I suspect it was built facing Stock Lodge, and they wanted a pretty brickwork to face there. It never features in any of the sales. When I was doing the renovation work there, I had the floorboards up and found coins there for every King George. George the First to George the Sixth. George the First died in 1727, George the Second in 1760. I'm not saying the coins were, but sometime within 50 years either side of that, these coins could have been minted. But certainly it looks like that house goes back into the 1700s, although when I bought it in the first place, the estate agent said it was about 1825. I think he was guessing. I think they're older than that. None of this helps us date Stock Lodge precisely. I don't think it's quite as old as 1723, and several people have suggested around 1750. One of the owners of Stock Lodge has probably got the deeds, but the deeds I saw only went back to 1918. They didn't have the full conveyancing all the way back, unfortunately. Most of you will have heard tell of the lodge having been built on the side of an old inn, the Rose, and indeed the cottage next door is called Rose Cottage. The Rose Inn is mentioned in the parish registers of 1676 as being in the High Street, but this is 100 years or so before the earliest mention I can find of Stock Lodge. So I can't make any substantial link between the two. So, to summarise, here's the list of owners to the best of my ability. 1818 is Thomas Edward, who's been married from there. Horace Batchel, who I found. The John Wright or John and Mary Osborne combination in the 1841 census. John Lennox in the 1851 census. Richard B. Durham, the seafaring man in 1861 and another mention in 1863. 1871, Mrs. Mary Cook, widow. Stephen Whitman Silver. 1901 to 1918, Marmaduke Matthews. 1918 to 1925, Sir James Wilcox. Then the Brazier Craigs from 1925 to 46, and the Fosters from 46 to 65, 65 to 66, the same breaker of the estate. Finally, my thanks to several people in Warring, Morwenna Ackhurst, Jenny Barclay, Angela Bill, Yvonne Blackwood, John Williams, June Springett, Julia Seaman, Brian and Wendy Yeller, all from within the society have given me help, and indeed Jeannie Baker, Brian Clifford, Billy Hewitt, Pat Todd and other village folk. Staff at Brook Farm Riding School were also very helpful, and of course the staff at Essex Record Centre were particularly friendly in pointing me in the right direction for much of the older information. Thank you for your attention. Sorry it's a bit disjointed, but it's difficult doing this now. We'll take questions if
A snippet of information. I actually bought number 29 from Mrs. Waller,
Right, yeah.
in 1966, 67, I think. And next door at that stage was Bill Cotty.
Yes.
And there was a pump house, because at that stage they had a cesspool. And there was a little brick pump house there that Bill and I used to take turns at activating to empty the cesspool. And they went down the drains down towards the church. Unfortunately, sometimes the pipe got broke, and I well remember on 2 or 3 occasions, the whole of the field, I think where you now live, was just a sea of effluent.
Good route.
And we were there for about 3 years. And Phyllis Cable used to come in and be with our family and babysit.
Did she?
Yeah, lovely. And we sold to a family called Goldfish.
Right.
We actually extended number 29.
Yeah, 29 was the last of the old
That's
cottages. As I say, these lodge, stock lodge freehold. You may want to look at that, you see those land divisions. Yes.
You're talking about the rows. Basically, as I understand it, this probably went back many, many years, probably Tudor times.
Yeah.
The story is that the drive in front of Stock Lodge was sort of part of the pull-in to the rows. What the rows was like was, it was something like the ship is now. You had the road, and you had this very, yes, that's right. And apparently, I have been told that the cellars of Stock Lodge are actually.
That is the rumour.
Yeah, there's only rumours. Yeah.
Any way that can be.
Yeah, I mean,
at all, with at least 100-year gap between what you're talking about and the first possible. It's also 150 years more likely.
Yeah, that's
the
it.
earliest information I can find on Stock.
Yes, and
that is the rumour that goes around. Isn't it?
yes.
Any other points?
When was the Staking Drive area built?
Well, the Daking Drive itself must have been just after the war, mustn't it? Because the area houses were there during the war. The whole idea of the prefabricated houses was a wartime thing, wasn't it? So I think they must have been built either at the tail end of the war or just after. And then the Daking Drive must have come after that because people moved out of the area houses into Daking Drive houses, weren't they?
They built after the war.
They built after the war, wasn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next to Bill Cotty was Mr. English. He lived there.
Did he?
He lived in the house next to Bill Cotty. He was a gardener.
Right, yes, probably for Stock Lodge.
Yeah. He used to work with my father.
Did he?
Yeah, my father used to do the vegetables and he used to do the ordinary garden.
Right.
My father used to look after the cows, cut the wood, look after the pigs. They had pigs there as well.
Yeah.
So did your father live in 27, 29?
No, my father lived in Well Lane.
Are you the gentleman I referred to here with the photographs?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, that's
Yes,
yes.
Brown Clifford.
Yeah. Oh, well, thanks for use of
So it's cottage older than Stock Lodge, so that?
Rose Cottage.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it was named after this rumour of the Rose Pub being there, I don't know.
Because I mean, I think it's.
Where's Rose Cottage? In the front, on the main road?
It's on the main road, this side.
Is that where the rose gardens were?
No, it's next door to the Rose Garden, yeah.
Oh.
Where the Rose Garden, the house next door to it. Stock Lodge, before they built one in the garden, Stock Lodge.
How far your teams
Well, we need to go back to 1840, but I don't know, that was, they said that, you know, they did go before that, but it was then, You've got some stable, you know, the garage is a stable,
No. They built after war, Hilly built the road. Yeah.
Thank you very much to
talk. I think we've all of us been absolutely glued to every word you've said. It's been
Well, I found it interesting too,
Yes,
because
it
it's much
So-
more there than I thought about it.
thank you very much indeed, and maybe possibly you could do something with a little something in here. Might come in handy if you haven't tied up too tight. There we go. As a little thank you from us
Thank you
all.
very much.